The phone call that shattered my world came at 2:37 on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing marketing campaigns at my Denver office. Eddie's pawn shop flashed on my caller ID a number I didn't recognize, but somehow felt compelled to answer. The gravelly voice on the other end belonged to an elderly man who introduced himself as Frank, the shop owner. His words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. Someone had pawned my deceased father's Rolex Submariner for $8,000, and there was something hidden inside that I desperately needed to see immediately. My hands began trembling uncontrollably as the devastating realization crashed over me that my mother, Helen, and stepfather, Gary, must have stolen the only precious memento from my dad who died in that horrific construction accident 3 years ago. I bolted from my cubicle without explanation, leaving confused coworkers staring at my abandoned computer screen, still displaying half-finished promotional materials for a local restaurant chain. The drive to Eddie's pawn shop felt like navigating through thick fog, my vision blurred by tears of rage and disbelief. How could my own mother betray me like this? That Rolex wasn't just jewelry. It represented every bedtime story my dad told me every Saturday morning, pancake breakfast, every proud smile when I graduated college. He wore it during my wedding rehearsal dinner just months before the accident, promising it would be mine someday. Frank turned out to be a weathered man in his 70s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and calloused hands that spoke of decades working with precious metals and gemstones. His shop smelled of metal polish and old leather with glass cases displaying everything from vintage guitars to diamond rings. When I walked through his door, Frank immediately recognized the desperation in my expression. "You must be the daughter," he said gently, leading me to a workbench in the back room. Soon as I heard that story about the deceased relative, something felt wrong. People don't usually sell family heirlooms unless they're desperate or lying. I fumbled through my purse for my phone, showing Frank dozens of photos of my father wearing the distinctive black-faced Rolex. There he was, at my high school graduation, his arm around my shoulders, the watch clearly visible on his left wrist. Another picture from my 25th birthday party showed him checking the time on that same watch while cutting my cake. I also produced a copy of his death certificate from my wallet, a document I'd carried for 3 years, like a talisman of grief. "That's definitely the same timepiece," Frank confirmed, studying the photos carefully. But here's what's interesting. When I was examining it for authenticity, the watch felt heavier than it should have. Rolex Submariners have a specific weight, and this one was about half an ounce off. My heart pounded as Frank retrieved a small wooden box from his safe. Inside, nestled in black velvet, lay my father's watch, exactly as I remembered it. But Frank wasn't finished with his revelation. "I've been in this business for 43 years, he continued, "and I've learned to trust my instincts. So I took the watch to my repair specialist, Jimmy, who's been fixing timepieces since the 70s. Jimmy discovered something remarkable. Frank gently lifted the watch and showed me how the back case could be twisted off with special tools. Inside the mechanism, where most people would never think to look, was a tiny hidden compartment, cleverly concealed behind the balance wheel assembly. From this secret space, Frank produced a micro USB drive no bigger than my thumbnail and a piece of paper folded so small it looked like a grain of rice. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the paper to reveal my father's distinctive handwriting in blue ink. "For my princess, the truth about the Brookfield site." The words hit me like ice water. Brookfield Construction was the company where my father worked the job site, where his life ended when scaffolding collapsed during a routine inspection. I'd always been told it was a tragic accident, an unfortunate combination of weather conditions and equipment failure that no one could have prevented. "I don't want any money for this," Frank said firmly, pressing the watch into my hands. "Family heirlooms belong with family, not hanging in pawn shop windows. Besides, your father obviously went to great lengths to make sure you'd find whatever's on that drive." I thanked Frank through tears that wouldn't stop flowing, promising to let him know what my father had hidden. The elderly man patted my shoulder with grandfatherly kindness before I stumbled back to my car, clutching the watch against my chest like armor against the world's cruelty. During the drive home, my grief transformed into something harder and more determined. My father had hidden something important enough to require secret compartments and coded messages. Whatever was on that USB drive, Gary and my mother had nearly destroyed it by selling the watch. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible, but now I had something more powerful than sadness. I had purpose. I drove straight to my childhood home on Maple Street, a modest 2-story house with yellow siding and a wraparound porch where my father used to sit reading construction manuals on Sunday afternoons. The familiar sight of the house now filled me with dread instead of comfort. Gary's pickup truck sat in the driveway next to my mother's sedan, both vehicles representing the life they'd built while systematically erasing traces of my father's existence. I didn't bother knocking. This was still my childhood home, and I wasn't about to treat my own mother like a stranger. The front door opened to reveal Helen and Gary settled on the living room couch, sharing a bowl of popcorn while watching some mindless reality television show. They looked so comfortable, so completely unburdened by guilt or remorse, that my anger threatened to boil over before I could get answers. Candy. Helen jumped up, her face immediately flushing with what I hoped was shame. What a surprise, you should have called first. Should I have called before you stole from me too? I held up the Rolex, watching both of their expressions shift from surprise to panic. Eddie's pawn shop called me this afternoon. Apparently someone pawned my father's watch for $8,000. Gary muted the television and slowly stood up, his 6-foot frame suddenly seeming less intimidating than pathetic. At 52, he was still handsome in a weathered blue-collar way, but now I could see the weakness in his eyes that I'd missed before. Now hold on. Gary started, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd learned to hate. Before you go making accusations, maybe you should understand the full situation. The full situation. I couldn't keep the sarcasm out of my voice. You mean the situation where you broke into my apartment and stole the only thing I had left of my father? Helen's face crumpled with guilt. We used your spare key, she whispered. You were on that business trip to Phoenix and we thought you'd never notice. Never notice. The words came out as a shriek. You thought I'd never notice that my father's watch was missing. Gary stepped forward, his hands raised in what he probably thought was a calming gesture. Look, we were desperate. Okay, Brett's app development company needed startup capital and the watch was just sitting in your jewelry box collecting dust. We figured we could help Brett get his business off the ground and buy you something nice to replace it. Replace it? I stared at him in disbelief. You can't replace a dead father's watch, Gary. You can't replace memories. We were going to tell you, Helen said weakly. Once Brett's company started making money, we planned to buy the watch back and explain everything. Gary nodded enthusiastically. Brett's got this incredible app idea that's going to revolutionize how construction companies manage their projects. He just needed seed money to hire developers and file patents. That watch money could turn into millions once the app takes off. Something in Gary's tone made me suspicious. Where is Brett's office? What's the name of his company? Gary and Helen exchanged glances that lasted a split second too long. Well, Gary stammered. He's working from home right now. Lots of tech companies start that way, and the company name is still being finalized with lawyers. When did you last see Brett working on this app? I pressed. He's very secretive about his work, Helen said quickly. You know how competitive the tech industry is. He can't risk anyone stealing his ideas. Gary's expression darkened. Actually, now that you mention it, Brett has been acting strange lately. Missing family dinners, avoiding questions about his progress, coming home at weird hours. What kind of weird hours? 3, 4 in the morning sometimes, Gary admitted. And his car smells like cigarette smoke even though he quit smoking years ago. Plus, I found poker chips in his cup holder last week. Helen looked shocked. Poker chips? Brett doesn't gamble. That's what I thought too, Gary said grimly. But when I asked him about it, he got defensive and changed the subject. And there have been some suspicious cash withdrawals from the account where we deposited the watch money. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. I could see the doubt creeping into Helen's eyes as she processed her stepson's suspicious behavior. Gary looked equally troubled, as if he was realizing for the first time that Brett might have manipulated them into stealing my father's watch. But I had bigger concerns than Brett's potential gambling problem. "There's something else you both need to know," I said, pulling out the tiny USB drive. "This was hidden inside the watch. Dad left me a message." I handed Helen the small piece of paper with my father's handwriting. She read it aloud in a trembling voice. "For my princess, the truth about the Brookfield site." Gary's face went completely white. The transformation was so dramatic that Helen noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Nothing," Gary said quickly, but his voice cracked on the word. "It's just, your husband worked at a lot of construction sites. Brookfield was just one of many." But I could see the fear in his eyes, and suddenly I understood that my father's hidden message was more significant than any of us had realized. Gary knew something about Brookfield construction, something that terrified him enough to make him lie to his own wife. "I'm going to find out what's on this drive," I announced, slipping the USB back into my pocket. "And if I discover that you knew anything about my father's death, Gary, I swear I'll make you pay for it." I turned to leave, but Helen grabbed my arm. "Candy, wait. I know you're angry and you have every right to be. But please don't let this destroy our family. Your father wouldn't have wanted that." "Our family was destroyed the day you chose Gary over my father's memory," I replied coldly. "This just makes it official." Back in my apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit in a converted warehouse near downtown Denver, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and the mysterious USB drive. My hands shook as I inserted the drive, unsure whether I was ready to learn whatever truth my father had died trying to tell me. The drive contained hundreds of files organized into folders with names like safety violations, inspection reports, audio evidence, and insurance claims. My father had been methodical in his documentation, dating every file and including detailed notes about locations, personnel, and safety concerns. I started with a folder labeled Personal Notes that contained what appeared to be a digital diary my father had kept during his final months. The entries painted a picture of a man growing increasingly concerned about dangerous practices at Brookfield construction sites across Colorado. March 15th. One entry began. Watched Gary dismiss safety concerns about scaffolding anchors at the Morrison site. Workers complained about loose connections, but Gary told them to stop being babies and finish the job. 3 hours later, a section collapsed. Luckily, no one was seriously hurt, but it could have been catastrophic. Another entry from April 2nd was even more disturbing. Found falsified OSHA inspection reports in Gary's truck. Real reports documented missing safety harnesses and inadequate fall protection, but the filed versions show all equipment is satisfactory. Gary is systematically covering up safety violations to keep projects on schedule. As I read deeper into my father's notes, a pattern emerged. Gary wasn't just cutting corners or making occasional poor decisions. He was deliberately creating dangerous working conditions and then covering up the evidence when accidents occurred. The most damning evidence was in a folder labeled Audio Recordings. My father had secretly recorded conversations with co-workers, supervisors, and safety inspectors using a digital recorder hidden in his hard hat. One conversation from April 28th made my blood run cold. "We can't keep operating like this," my father's voice said clearly through my laptop speakers. "Someone's going to get killed." "Listen, Bob," came Gary's unmistakable reply. "I appreciate your concerns, but we've got deadlines to meet and budgets to maintain. These construction workers know the risks when they sign up for the job." "That's not the point," my father argued. "We're supposed to minimize those risks, not ignore them completely. Look, accidents happen in construction. That's why we carry insurance. But if we spend all our time and money on excessive safety measures, we'll never complete projects on time or within budget. Excessive safety measures. My father's voice rose with anger. Gary, we're talking about basic OSHA requirements, safety harnesses, proper scaffolding equipment inspections. These aren't luxuries. I'm the site supervisor, Gary replied coldly, which means safety protocols are my decision, not yours. If you can't follow my leadership, maybe you should consider finding work elsewhere. The recording ended there, but the timestamp showed it was made just 2 weeks before my father's fatal accident. I sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what I'd just heard. Gary had been pressuring my father to ignore safety violations, and my father had been pushing back. 2 weeks later, my father was dead. But the most shocking discovery was yet to come. In a folder labeled Insurance Investigation, I found correspondence between my father and a private investigator named Diana Walsh. The emails revealed that my father had contacted Walsh about suspicious patterns in Brookfield construction accident reports and insurance claims. Mr. Chen. One email from Walsh read, "Thank you for providing the documentation we discussed. My preliminary analysis confirms your suspicions about unusual accident patterns at Brookfield construction sites. Over the past 3 years, workplace fatalities at Brookfield sites have occurred at a rate nearly 4 times the industry average. More concerning is that each fatal accident has resulted in substantial insurance payouts, and in every case, Gary Martinez was the supervising foreman." Gary Martinez. I stared at the name on the screen, my mind reeling. My stepfather's last name was Patterson, not Martinez. He'd been using a different identity when these emails were written. I scrolled through more emails and found Walsh explaining that Gary had worked under multiple surnames at various construction companies across Colorado and Wyoming. Each job had ended with safety incidents, worker injuries, or suspicious accidents. Court documents showed Gary had been sued twice for workplace negligence, but both cases had been settled out of court with sealed agreements. The final email in the folder, sent just 3 days before my father's death, contained the most devastating revelation of all. Walsh had uncovered evidence that Brookfield Construction was deliberately staging workplace accidents to collect insurance payouts. The scheme required an inside person to ensure specific safety failures occurred at predetermined times, creating plausible accidents that would trigger large insurance claims. Mr. Chen. Walsh had written, "I believe your life may be in danger. The evidence you've provided suggests that Gary Martinez has been orchestrating workplace accidents for insurance fraud purposes. If he suspects you're investigating his activities, he may take steps to silence you permanently. Please contact me immediately so we can discuss protective measures and coordinate with federal authorities." But my father never got the chance to respond to that email. 3 days later, he was dead crushed when scaffolding collapsed during what was supposed to be a routine safety inspection at the Brookfield construction site in Westminster. The official report listed the cause as equipment failure due to high winds and structural fatigue. I sat back in my chair, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. My father hadn't died in a random accident. He'd been murdered by my stepfather to cover up an insurance fraud scheme that had probably killed multiple workers over several years. Gary had killed my father, then moved in on my grieving mother within months of the funeral. He'd married her not out of love, but to gain access to any evidence my father might have left behind. And just 2 days ago, he'd nearly succeeded in destroying the most crucial evidence by selling my father's watch. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I felt physically ill. But underneath the nausea and shock, a cold determination was forming. My father had died trying to expose Gary's crimes and protect other workers from the same fate. Now it was my responsibility to finish what he'd started. I picked up my phone to call Diana Walsh, praying the private investigator was still alive and still working the case. It was time to turn my father's hidden evidence into justice. Diana Walsh answered her phone on the second ring, and when I explained who I was, her response sent chills down my spine. "I've been waiting 3 years for this call," she said without hesitation. "Can you meet me tonight? There's a lot we need to discuss, and it's not safe to talk over the phone." We agreed to meet at a 24-hour diner called Mel's on Colfax Avenue, a busy location where our conversation would blend into the background noise of late-night Denver traffic and shift workers grabbing coffee. I spent the remaining daylight hours combing through every file on my father's USB drive, searching for additional details about Gary's criminal history. What I discovered painted a picture of a man who had turned workplace murder into a profitable career. Gary had worked under at least 4 different surnames over the past decade: Martinez, Coleman, Hartwell, and now Patterson. Each identity came with fabricated employment history and forged safety certifications that allowed him to obtain supervisory positions at construction companies throughout the Mountain West. The pattern was always the same. Gary would take a job as a site supervisor or safety coordinator, gradually identify workers who asked too many questions or pushed back against dangerous practices, then orchestrate accidents that would eliminate the problematic employees while generating substantial insurance payouts for the construction companies. The businesses were usually struggling financially and desperate enough to look the other way when their insurance claims suddenly improved their bottom line. My father's research had uncovered similar suspicious deaths at construction sites in Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico, all involving companies where Gary had worked under his various aliases. In each case, the victims were experienced workers who had raised safety concerns or threatened to report violations to OSHA inspectors. The insurance payouts were staggering. My father's death alone had triggered a $2.7 million claim for accidental death, with additional payouts for equipment replacement and site cleanup. Over the past 5 years, Gary's manufactured accidents had generated more than $15 million in insurance money, with Gary receiving substantial kickbacks from grateful construction company owners. But Gary's crimes went beyond simple fraud. The emails between my father and Diana Walsh revealed that Gary had been targeting the families of his victims after their deaths, using his knowledge of their financial situations and emotional vulnerabilities to gain access to any evidence they might have left behind. In at least 3 cases, Gary had seduced and married the widows of men he'd murdered moving into their homes and gradually stealing or destroying anything that might incriminate him. He'd married Helen using the same playbook, courting a grieving widow with promises of security and companionship, while systematically searching for evidence that might expose his crimes. The most disturbing discovery was a spreadsheet hidden in one of my father's encrypted folders that tracked Gary's romantic relationships with victims' families. Helen was listed as Target 7, with detailed notes about her financial assets, my father's work schedule, and potential evidence locations in our house. Gary had been planning my father's murder for months, gathering intelligence about our family's routines and looking for the optimal time to stage a fatal accident. He'd even researched my college schedule and work commitments to ensure I wouldn't be around to ask inconvenient questions during my mother's grieving process. By the time I arrived at Mel's Diner, I felt like I was carrying the weight of multiple murders on my shoulders. Diana Walsh turned out to be a thin, intense woman in her 50s, with graying brown hair and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She looked exactly like what she was, a former police detective turned private investigator who had seen too much human cruelty to be shocked by anything. "Your father was a brave man," Diana said without preamble as we settled into a corner booth. "Most people would have walked away rather than risk their lives exposing something this big." "How big is it?" I asked, sliding my father's USB drive across the table. Diana plugged the drive into a small laptop she'd brought, scanning through the files with practiced efficiency. "Bigger than your father realized," she said grimly. "Gary Martinez, or Patterson, or whatever he's calling himself these days, is part of a network that's been operating across multiple states for at least 8 years. She opened a folder on her own computer and showed me photographs of construction sites, insurance documents, and victim profiles that made my stomach lurch. 17 men had died in suspicious workplace accidents linked to Gary's activities, leaving behind widows, children, and parents who would never know their loved ones had been murdered for money. The insurance companies are starting to notice the patterns, Diana explained, but they're more interested in recovering their money than seeking justice for the victims. That's why I've been building a federal case, murder for hire, conspiracy insurance fraud, and racketeering charges that could put Gary and his associates away for life. What about the construction companies? I asked. Are they part of the conspiracy? Some are willing participants, others are just desperate enough to accept Gary's results without asking questions. Brookfield Construction definitely knew what they were buying when they hired Gary. Their financial records show they were facing bankruptcy before Gary joined their team. Now, they're one of the most profitable construction companies in Colorado. Diana closed her laptop and leaned forward, her expression deadly serious. Here's what you need to understand, Candy. Gary isn't working alone. He's got partners in law enforcement, insurance investigation, and construction management who help cover up his crimes. Some of these people have been protecting him for years. How do we stop him? We need more evidence, Diana said. Your father's files are crucial, but we need something that definitively proves Gary orchestrated specific murders. Ideally, we need Gary to confess to his crimes while being recorded. How do we make that happen? Diana smiled for the first time since we'd met, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. We make Gary think there's a witness he needs to eliminate, someone who has evidence that could destroy him. You want to use me as bait? I want to use you as the key to bringing down a man who's murdered 17 people and destroyed countless families. But I won't lie to you about the risks. Gary has killed to protect his secrets before, and he won't hesitate to kill again if he feels cornered. I thought about my father's final message hidden in a watch that Gary had nearly succeeded in selling. My father had died trying to expose these crimes, and now I had the chance to finish what he'd started. The risks were terrifying, but the alternative was letting Gary continue murdering innocent workers while living comfortably off my mother's love and trust. What do you need me to do? Diana opened her laptop again and began outlining a plan that would either bring Gary to justice or get both of us killed. But for the first time since receiving that phone call from Frank's pawn shop, I felt like I was taking control of the situation instead of just reacting to betrayals and revelations. My father's death would finally have meaning, and Gary would pay for every life he'd stolen. The next morning, I called in sick to work and decided to investigate Brett's activities before Diana and I implemented our plan to trap Gary. If Brett really was gambling away the money from my father's watch, I needed to understand the full scope of his deception and how it connected to Gary's criminal enterprise. Brett lived in a studio apartment in a converted warehouse district near downtown Denver, the kind of trendy area where young professionals convinced themselves they were living an urban lifestyle instead of just paying too much rent for concrete floors and exposed pipes. I parked across the street at 7:30 in the morning and settled in to watch his routine. At 9:15, Brett emerged from the building wearing designer jeans, expensive sneakers, and a leather jacket that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. For someone supposedly struggling to fund a startup company, he certainly dressed well. He climbed into a black BMW sedan that looked like it had just rolled off a dealership lot. I followed Brett through downtown Denver traffic, expecting him to head toward a coffee shop or co-working space where tech entrepreneurs might gather to develop revolutionary apps. Instead, he drove to an upscale shopping center in Cherry Creek and spent 2 hours at a high-end electronics store, apparently purchasing multiple laptops and smartphones that he loaded into his car. From there, Brett drove to a check-cashing business in a strip mall on the outskirts of the city. I watched from the parking lot of a nearby fast food restaurant as he emerged carrying a thick envelope that he immediately stuffed into his jacket pocket. The entire transaction took less than 10 minutes, but Brett looked nervous the entire time, constantly checking over his shoulder as if he expected to be followed. Brett's next stop was the most revealing. He drove to what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse in an industrial section of the city, where legitimate businesses had long since moved to safer neighborhoods. But the parking lot contained dozens of expensive cars, and I could see men in suits coming and going through a side entrance, marked only with a small red door. I parked behind a rusted shipping container and watched through binoculars as Brett approached the red door. A large man in a black suit stepped outside, spoke briefly with Brett, then gestured for him to follow. Brett looked terrified but compliant as they disappeared inside the building. For the next 4 hours, I waited in my car taking notes and photographing everyone who entered or left the warehouse. The clientele was clearly upscale, mostly men in business attire driving luxury vehicles. This wasn't a neighborhood poker game or casual gambling operation. This was an organized, high-stakes gambling den, catering to people with serious money to lose. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Brett finally emerged from the warehouse, but he wasn't alone. 2 men flanked him as they walked to the parking lot, both significantly larger than Brett and wearing the kind of ill-fitting suits that suggested they were muscle rather than gamblers. The conversation appeared heated, with Brett gesturing frantically, while the 2 men remained stone-faced and threatening. I fumbled with my phone to start recording as the confrontation escalated near Brett's BMW. The acoustics of the empty parking lot carried their voices clearly across the distance. "Please," Brett was saying, his voice cracking with desperation. "I just need 2 more weeks. The money is coming, I swear." 2 weeks. The larger of the 2 men stepped closer to Brett, invading his personal space in a way that made threat implicit. "Your father said the same thing last month, and your uncle said it the month before. Your whole family seems to have a problem keeping promises." "My stepfather isn't my real family," Brett protested. "And I didn't know about any previous debts." "Doesn't matter," the second man interjected. His voice carried a slight accent that sounded Eastern European. "In our business, family debts are shared debts. Your stepfather Gary owes us $15,000 from his own gambling plus interest. You owe us $60,000 from today's losses plus what you borrowed last week. Combined total is $87,000. Brett's face went completely white. 87,000. That's impossible. I only borrowed 40,000 total and I paid back 20. Interest, my friend. 20% per week compounded. Very standard terms that were clearly explained when you first requested credit. I can't possibly get $87,000 in 2 weeks. Brett said, his voice barely above a whisper. The larger man smiled, but it was the kind of expression that made predators look friendly compared to their prey. Then perhaps your family can help. Your mother seems like a nice woman. Pretty house on Maple Street with the yellow shutters. Very peaceful neighborhood. Brett's terror was now complete and visible. Leave my mother out of this. She has nothing to do with gambling. She has everything to do with this, the Eastern European man replied coldly. She married a man who owes us money, and she raised a son who owes us money. In our culture, family obligations are sacred. What do you want me to do? You have until the end of this month to bring us the full amount. Cash only. If you fail, we'll collect what we're owed from whatever assets your family possesses. Houses, cars, jewelry, businesses. We're very thorough in our collection methods. And if there aren't enough assets, the 2 men exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their willingness to escalate beyond financial pressure. Then we'll discuss alternative payment arrangements. Your mother seems healthy enough to work off debts if necessary. Brett looked like he might vomit. You can't be serious. Deadly serious. End of the month, Brett. $87,000 or your entire family discovers what happens to people who don't honor their commitments. The men walked away without another word, leaving Brett standing alone beside his BMW, shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. He fumbled with his car keys for several minutes before managing to start the engine and drive away, his usual confident demeanor completely shattered. I followed Brett from a safe distance as he drove aimlessly through Denver for nearly an hour, apparently trying to process what he'd just heard. Eventually, he pulled into the parking lot of a small park and sat motionless in his car for another 30 minutes, occasionally talking on his phone in conversations that looked increasingly frantic. The implications of what I'd witnessed were staggering. Brett wasn't just gambling away my father's watch money. He'd become trapped in a debt spiral with dangerous criminals who now viewed my mother and Gary as additional sources of payment. The theft of my father's watch wasn't just betrayal. It was desperation driven by threats against the entire family. But the most disturbing revelation was that Gary apparently had his own gambling debts with the same organization. The men had specifically mentioned Gary owing $15,000, suggesting that my stepfather's financial problems extended far beyond Brett's startup story. I thought about my mother innocently believing that her new husband was helping his son launch a technology company, completely unaware that both men were trapped in debt to criminals who wouldn't hesitate to hurt her if payments stopped coming. Gary hadn't just married my mother to gain access to my father's evidence. He'd married her to access her assets for gambling debts that predated their relationship. As I drove home, I realized that Gary's criminal activities were even more complex than Diana Walsh and I had suspected. He wasn't just murdering construction workers for insurance money, he was also stealing from families to feed a gambling addiction that put everyone around him in mortal danger. The plan to expose Gary's crimes had just become more urgent. If we didn't act quickly, my mother might become a victim of the same violence that had already claimed my father's life. I debated whether to tell my mother about Brett's gambling debts and the threats against our family, but decided that revealing Gary's criminal history would be more effective in turning her against him. Diana Walsh had emphasized the importance of isolating Gary from his support network, and Helen's emotional loyalty was currently his strongest protection. However, when I arrived at my childhood home the next evening, I found my mother in a state that suggested Gary's deceptions were already unraveling without my intervention. Helen sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by scattered papers, tears streaming down her face as she stared at Gary's open laptop computer. "Mom." I approached cautiously, unsure whether Gary was somewhere in the house. "What's wrong?" Helen looked up with red-rimmed eyes that held a mixture of heartbreak and fury I'd never seen before. "I was trying to help Gary apply for jobs online," she said in a voice thick with emotion. "His construction work has been sporadic lately, and I thought maybe he could find something more stable." She gestured toward the laptop screen, which displayed a folder labeled with our home address. "I was looking for his resume file when I found these." I moved closer to see what had devastated my mother so completely. The folder contained detailed floor plans of our house, including measurements of every room, locations of windows and doors, and notations about security system components. But these weren't architectural drawings or insurance documents. They were surveillance materials, the kind of detailed intelligence that criminals used to plan burglaries. "There are more folders." Helen continued clicking through additional files. "Gary has been researching the value of everything in this house. Your father's coin collection, my grandmother's china, set the antique furniture from the estate sale. He even has photographs of my jewelry box with estimates of what each piece might be worth." My blood ran cold as I realized the full scope of Gary's planning. "How long has he been collecting this information?" "Based on the file dates, he started 3 weeks after we got married," Helen said bitterly. "While I was still grieving your father and believing I'd found someone who actually cared about me, Gary was cataloging everything he could steal." I sat down beside my mother and put my arm around her shoulders, feeling her body shake with suppressed rage. "Did you confront him about this?" "He's not here. Gary left this morning saying he had a job interview in Colorado Springs, but now I'm wondering if he's even looking for legitimate work." Helen clicked on another folder that made my heart stop. It contained detailed research about my father's rare coin collection, a hobby that had consumed his free time for nearly 20 years. The collection included Morgan silver dollars, walking Liberty, half dollars, and several extremely rare coins that my father had acquired through decades of careful trading and saving. "I thought Gary didn't know about the coin collection," I said quietly. "So did I. Your father kept it in that old safe in the basement, and I never mentioned it because it felt like something private that belonged to your father's memory." "How much is the collection worth?" Helen's voice was barely a whisper. According to Gary's research, about $27,000, maybe more if he found buyers who specialize in rare coins. We sat in silence for several minutes processing the magnitude of Gary's betrayal. He hadn't just married my mother for love or companionship. He'd married her to gain access to a house full of valuable items that he'd been systematically cataloging for theft. The man my mother trusted with her heart and her future was planning to rob her blind. "There's something else," Helen said, opening a new folder. "Gary has been researching my life insurance policy." The files contained copies of insurance documents, including the $200,000 life insurance policy my father had maintained on my mother through his construction company benefits. The policy had remained active after my father's death, with Helen continuing to pay the premiums as a form of financial security. But Gary's research went far beyond simply understanding the policy details. He'd been investigating how long someone had to be married to a policyholder before they could claim benefits as a surviving spouse. He'd also researched Colorado state laws regarding inheritance rights for stepchildren and surviving spouses. "He's been planning to kill me," Helen said with shocking calm, "just like he probably killed your father." I stared at my mother in amazement. "You know about Dad's investigation?" Helen nodded slowly. "I've suspected for months that your father's accident wasn't really an accident. Robert was too careful about safety to die from something as simple as scaffolding collapse. And Gary's behavior after the funeral was always strange. Too eager to help, too quick to move in, too interested in your father's personal papers." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I wanted to believe I deserved happiness after losing Robert. I wanted to believe that Gary actually loved me instead of just using me." Helen's voice broke on the last words. "I was so lonely, Candy, so desperate to feel like someone cared about me that I ignored every red flag." I pulled my mother closer, feeling her pain as if it were my own. "It's not your fault, Mom. Gary is a professional manipulator who targets grieving women. You weren't his first victim, and if we don't stop him, you won't be his last." "What do you mean, not his first victim?" I took a deep breath and began explaining everything I'd learned about Gary's criminal history, the insurance fraud scheme, and the multiple murders disguised as workplace accidents. Helen listened with growing horror as I described Diana Walsh's investigation and the evidence hidden in my father's watch. 17 men, Helen repeated when I finished. Gary has killed 17 people. At least 17. Diana thinks there might be more victims we haven't identified yet. Helen stared at Gary's laptop screen, her expression shifting from heartbreak to cold determination. "What do we do?" "We help Diana Walsh build a case that will put Gary in prison for the rest of his life," I said. "But first we need to make sure you're safe. If Gary suspects you know about his plans, he might accelerate his timeline for killing you." "I'm not running away," Helen said firmly. "If Gary thinks he can murder my husband and then rob me blind, he's about to learn that he picked the wrong family to terrorize." I felt a surge of pride at my mother's strength. The frightened, grieving widow who had fallen for Gary's manipulation was gone, replaced by a woman who understood exactly what kind of monster she'd been living with. "Diana has a plan to trap Gary," I explained. "But it's dangerous, and it requires making Gary think there's evidence that could expose his crimes." "What kind of evidence?" I hesitated, knowing that what I was about to propose would put my mother in serious danger. "We need Gary to believe that someone else has information about the insurance fraud scheme, someone he thinks he needs to eliminate." Helen's eyes narrowed with understanding. "You want to use me as bait." "Diana wants to use me, but after seeing Gary's research on your insurance policy, I think using you might be more effective. Gary has been planning to kill you anyway. We'd just be controlling the timing and location." "When do we start?" Helen and I spent the next 2 days carefully planning how to bait Gary into revealing his criminal activities, while Diana Walsh coordinated with federal investigators who'd been building their own case against the insurance fraud network. We decided that Helen would pretend to have discovered evidence of Gary's crimes, while accidentally letting slip that she'd contacted authorities about her suspicions. However, our careful plans were disrupted when Gary's gambling debts came calling directly to our front door. I was helping Helen prepare dinner on Thursday evening when 3 men in expensive suits knocked on the front door with the kind of authority that suggested they weren't selling insurance or seeking charitable donations. Helen looked through the peephole and immediately turned pale. "I don't recognize them," she whispered, "but they look like the kind of people Gary would owe money to." Before we could decide whether to answer the door, Gary's pickup truck pulled into the driveway. We watched through the kitchen window as Gary climbed out of his vehicle, saw the 3 men waiting on our porch, and froze with an expression of pure terror. Gary Martinez, the largest of the 3 men, called out in a voice that carried clearly through the evening air. "Or should we call you Gary Patterson? Now we need to have a conversation." Gary approached the porch slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Rico, what are you doing here? I told Dimitri I'd have the money by next week." "Next week became this week when your boy Brett lost another $15,000 at our tables," the man named Rico replied. "Seems like gambling problems run in your family." Helen grabbed my arm as the implications sank in. These were the same loan sharks who had threatened Brett at the warehouse, and now they were collecting debts from Gary directly at our home. "I don't know anything about Brett's gambling," Gary protested weakly. "Course you don't," said a second man with a thick Eastern European accent that I recognized from my surveillance of Brett. "Just like you didn't know anything about your own $47,000 debt when you disappeared from Wyoming 2 years ago." Rico stepped closer to Gary, invading his personal space in a way that made the threat implicit. "See, Gary, that's the thing about borrowing money from us. Geographic relocation doesn't cancel your obligations. Neither does changing your last name or marrying lonely widows." "I've been working construction jobs," Gary said desperately. "The pay is irregular, but I'm good for the money." "Construction jobs," the third man repeated mockingly. "Is that what you call your insurance fraud scheme? Very creative career description." Helen and I exchanged glances of shock and terror. These criminals knew about Gary's involvement in insurance fraud, which meant Gary's criminal activities extended far beyond what Diana Walsh and I had suspected. "I don't know what you're talking about," Gary replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Rico pulled out a manila folder and began reading from what appeared to be surveillance reports. "Brookfield Construction Morrison Site, March 22nd. Scaffolding collapse, 1 fatality, $2.7 million insurance payout. Your cut was what, $300,000 plus, whatever you've stolen from your current wife's house. You've been watching me." We watch all our clients, Gary, especially ones who try to disappear owing us substantial money. Did you really think we wouldn't notice when you started using Robert Chen's widow as your personal bank account? The mention of my father's name sent ice through my veins. These criminals had been monitoring Gary's relationship with my mother from the beginning, treating her as a financial asset in Gary's debt repayment plan. "How much does he owe you?" Helen called out through the screen door, startling all 4 men. Rico smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. "Mrs. Patterson, how nice to finally meet you. Your husband owes us $67,000 plus interest plus collection fees. His stepson, Brett, owes us another $73,000 from this week's poker games. Combined debt is currently $147,000. Helen stepped onto the porch and I reluctantly followed, knowing that these men now considered us part of Gary's debt repayment strategy. And if Gary can't pay, then we collect from available family assets, the Eastern European man explained casually. "Houses, cars, jewelry, retirement accounts. We're very flexible about payment methods." "What if the family assets aren't worth enough to cover the debt?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. Rico's smile widened. "Then we discuss alternative arrangements. Your mother looks healthy enough for service industry work. Las Vegas has many opportunities for women willing to work off family debts." The threat was clear and nauseating. If Gary couldn't pay his gambling debts, these men would force my mother into prostitution to cover the balance. "You have until the end of this month," Rico continued. That's 9 days to produce $147,000 cash only. No checks, no promissory notes, no payment plans. And if we refuse, Helen asked with more courage than I could have managed. Then you discover what happens to people who don't honor their family obligations, the third man replied. Gary knows our collection methods from his time in Wyoming. He can explain the consequences after we leave. The three men walked back to their black SUV without another word, leaving Gary standing on our porch, looking like a man who'd just received a death sentence. Helen and I watched them drive away before turning to face the man who had brought this terror into our lives. "Inside," Helen commanded in a voice I'd never heard her use before. "You're going to explain everything, and I mean everything, or I'm calling the police right now." Gary followed us into the house like a condemned man walking to his execution, and for the first time since my father's death, I felt like we might actually have the upper hand. Gary's confession that evening was even more horrifying than I'd expected. Faced with the choice between admitting his crimes to Helen or dealing with Rico's collection methods, Gary chose to tell us the truth about his involvement in the insurance fraud network. It started in Wyoming. Gary began slumped in his favorite chair like a broken man. I was working construction for a company that was going bankrupt, and the owner approached me about staging an accident that would trigger an insurance payout large enough to save the business. "What kind of accident?" Helen demanded. "Equipment failure that injured 3 workers. Nothing fatal, just serious enough to justify a big insurance claim. I was supposed to ensure that a crane inspection report showed everything as safe, then arrange for the crane to malfunction during a lift." "And you agreed to this?" I couldn't keep the disgust out of my voice. Gary nodded miserably. "The company owner offered me $50,000, which was more money than I'd ever seen at one time. I thought it would be a one-time thing, just helping a desperate business survive. But it wasn't one time," Helen said with cold certainty. "The insurance company investigated and found the staged accident. Instead of prosecuting everyone involved, they offered to pay us to stage accidents at competing construction companies. Sabotage their safety records, drive up their insurance costs, force them out of business." I stared at Gary in disbelief. The insurance company was paying you to commit fraud against other insurance companies. Consolidated American Insurance was trying to eliminate smaller competitors by making their policies unprofitable, Gary explained. If a construction company had too many accidents, they'd lose coverage and go bankrupt. Then Consolidated American could buy their contracts at discount prices. "How many people have you killed?" Helen asked bluntly. Gary's face crumpled with what might have been genuine remorse. "I never meant for anyone to die. The plan was always just injuries serious enough to trigger insurance investigations. But sometimes accidents go wrong and people get killed instead of just hurt." "How many?" Helen repeated. 17 confirmed deaths over the past 5 years, Gary whispered. "Maybe more where I wasn't directly involved in staging the accidents." The number hit me like a physical blow. 17 families destroyed so Gary could collect kickbacks from insurance fraud. 17 sets of children who would grow up without fathers. 17 widows left to grieve and struggle financially. "What about my husband?" Helen's voice was deadly quiet. "Was Robert's death staged too?" Gary looked up with tears in his eyes, and I knew the answer before he spoke. Robert was getting too close to the truth. He documented safety violations, recorded conversations, contacted private investigators. The insurance companies told me he had to be eliminated. "So you murdered him?" "I removed safety barriers the night before his inspection, knowing he always checked the most dangerous areas first. The scaffolding collapse was supposed to look like equipment failure during high winds." Helen slapped Gary across the face with such force that the sound echoed through the living room. "You killed my husband and then seduced me at his funeral. You're a monster." I was supposed to search the house for any evidence Robert might have left. Gary continued, apparently beyond caring about his confession's implications. "But you were so devastated, so grateful for comfort, that I thought maybe I could just marry you and gain legitimate access to everything. Instead, you fell in love with gambling and ended up owing money to criminals, I said. Gary laughed bitterly. Fell in love with losing more like it. Every time I thought I could win back what I'd lost, I'd lose even more. Rico and his people keep very detailed records of who owes what. How much of the insurance money is left? Helen asked. None of it. Between gambling losses and payments to Consolidated American for new assignments, I've been living job to job for the past year. I thought about the implications of what Gary had revealed. If you're broke, how are you planning to pay Rico? Gary's expression became even more haunted. I was going to kill Helen and collect her life insurance, then sell this house and everything in it, maybe flee to Mexico with whatever money was left after paying Rico. When Helen demanded, "This weekend, I was going to tamper with your car's brakes and stage an accident while I had an alibi at Brett's apartment." The casual way Gary described planning my mother's murder made my stomach turn. This man had been living in our house, eating our food, sleeping in my mother's bed, all while plotting to kill her for insurance money. "What about Brett?" I asked. "Is he part of the insurance fraud too?" "Brett doesn't know anything about my real work," Gary said quickly. "He thinks I'm just a construction supervisor with bad luck at poker games. I introduced him to Rico's gambling operation to create debt that would pressure Helen into selling valuable items from the house. So Brett's gambling addiction is your fault. I needed a believable reason for financial emergencies that would justify selling Robert's watch, Helen's jewelry, the coin collection. Brett's debts gave me cover to gradually liquidate everything valuable in this house." Helen stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the neighborhood where she'd lived happily with my father for 15 years. "All of it was a lie," she said quietly. "Every moment of our marriage, every conversation, every time you told me you loved me, all of it was just part of your plan to rob me and kill me." "I did come to love you," Gary protested weakly. "That's why I kept delaying the murder. I kept thinking maybe I could find another way to pay Rico." "But you couldn't," I said, "so this weekend you were going to kill her anyway." Gary nodded miserably. Rico made it clear that his patience was exhausted. If I didn't pay by the end of the month, he'd start collecting from family members. I couldn't let that happen to you or Helen. "So instead, you decided to murder Mom yourself," I replied with disgust. It seemed like the only option that wouldn't get everyone killed. I looked at my mother, still staring out the window with her back to Gary, and realized that our plan to trap him into confessing had become irrelevant. Gary had just confessed to conspiracy fraud and 17 counts of premeditated murder. What we needed now wasn't more evidence, but a way to ensure he faced justice while keeping Rico's loan sharks from hurting our family. I quietly pulled out my phone and sent a text message to Diana Walsh. "Gary confessed everything. Need immediate help with dangerous loan sharks. Come to Helen's house now." Then I called 911 and reported that a man in our living room had just confessed to multiple murders and was planning to kill my mother this weekend. Whatever happened next, Gary's career as a killer for hire was finally over. Diana Walsh arrived at our house within 20 minutes of my text message, accompanied by FBI agent Sarah Mitchell and 2 local police officers who seemed surprisingly well informed about Gary's criminal activities. Gary was handcuffed and read his rights while Helen and I provided statements about his confessions and the loan shark's threats. "We've been building a case against Consolidated American Insurance for 18 months, Agent Mitchell explained as Gary was led to a police car. "Your father's evidence was the missing piece we needed to prove the conspiracy charges." Diana added, "The insurance fraud network involves dozens of construction companies, insurance adjusters, and criminal operatives across 7 states. Gary was just one piece of a much larger criminal enterprise." "What about Rico and his people?" Helen asked. "They're expecting payment by the end of the month, and they know where we live." Agent Mitchell exchanged glances with Diana before answering. "Rico Castellanos and his loan shark operation are already under federal investigation for money laundering and extortion. We can use Gary's debts as leverage to build cases against both criminal organizations. How, I asked. Gary is going to cooperate with our investigation, Diana explained. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he'll provide evidence about the insurance fraud network and help us set up a sting operation against Rico's organization. And if Gary refuses to cooperate, then he faces 17 counts of first-degree murder, federal conspiracy charges, and insurance fraud charges that could result in multiple life sentences, Agent Mitchell said grimly. Cooperation is his only chance of ever seeing freedom again. Over the next 2 hours, we learned that the FBI had been monitoring Consolidated American Insurance since receiving tips from families of workers killed in suspicious accidents. My father's investigation had provided the evidence necessary to connect individual murders to a systematic conspiracy involving insurance executives, construction company owners, and criminal operatives like Gary. The scope of the fraud is staggering, Diana explained. Over the past 8 years, Consolidated American has collected more than $200 million in fraudulent claims while eliminating dozens of smaller insurance competitors. How many people have been murdered? Helen asked. We've identified 43 suspicious deaths connected to the conspiracy, Agent Mitchell replied. Gary was directly involved in 17 of those murders, but he's provided information about other operatives who committed additional killings. The revelation that my father was one of 43 murder victims somehow made his death both more tragic and more meaningful. He hadn't died for nothing. His investigation was helping expose one of the largest criminal conspiracies in American insurance history. What happens to Brett? I asked, remembering that Gary's stepson was also trapped by Rico's loan shark operation. Brett Patterson has been cooperating with our investigation for 3 months. Agent Mitchell revealed, stunning both Helen and me into silence. Brett's been working with you, Helen repeated in disbelief. Diana nodded. Brett discovered Gary's criminal activities accidentally when he found insurance documents in Gary's truck. Instead of confronting Gary directly, Brett contacted our office and agreed to help gather evidence. But what about his gambling addiction? Brett isn't actually gambling, Agent Mitchell explained. His apparent addiction was a cover story that allowed him to meet with federal agents at Rico's establishment while wearing recording devices. Every conversation Gary had about the insurance fraud was secretly recorded by Brett. I stared at the FBI agent in amazement. Brett was working undercover this entire time. Brett was terrified that Gary would kill Helen if he suspected anyone in the family knew about his crimes, Diana said. So he maintained his cover as a gambling-addicted stepson while secretly documenting Gary's activities and communications with the criminal network. Where is Brett now? Helen asked. Safe house, Agent Mitchell replied. Once Gary realized Brett had been recording him, Brett's life was in immediate danger. We moved him to a secure location yesterday. Helen slumped into a chair, overwhelmed by the revelation that her stepson had been protecting her while risking his own life. All this time, I thought Brett was just another criminal taking advantage of our family. Brett loves his mother and wanted to protect her, Diana said gently. But he needed professional help to safely gather evidence against someone as dangerous as Gary. What happens now? I asked. Agent Mitchell pulled out a thick folder containing legal documents. Gary has agreed to testify against Consolidated American Insurance and Rico's organization in exchange for a plea deal that reduces his sentence to 25 years without parole. 25 years! I couldn't hide my outrage. He murdered 17 people, including my father. I understand your anger, Agent Mitchell said, but Gary's cooperation will help us convict dozens of other criminals and shut down a network that could have killed hundreds more people. Sometimes justice requires accepting imperfect outcomes to prevent future tragedies. Diana placed a hand on my shoulder. Your father's investigation didn't just expose Gary's crimes. It's going to bring down an entire criminal empire and save countless lives. The trials will take months, Agent Mitchell continued. but Consolidated American Insurance has already been shut down pending federal charges. The construction companies involved in the conspiracy are facing criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits from victims' families. And Rico Castellanos and 12 members of his organization were arrested this afternoon based on evidence Gary provided. Their loan shark operation has been completely dismantled. Helen looked up with the first smile I'd seen from her in months. "So we're safe?" "You're safe," Agent Mitchell confirmed. "The immediate threats against your family have been eliminated." As the FBI agents prepared to leave, Diana handed me a business card for a victim services coordinator who could help our family navigate the complex legal proceedings ahead. "The trials will be difficult," she warned, "but your father's sacrifice is going to result in justice for dozens of families." After everyone left, Helen and I sat in our living room processing everything we'd learned. Gary was in federal custody. Brett was safe in witness protection, and the criminal network that had destroyed our family was finally being brought to justice. "I keep thinking about your father," Helen said quietly. "If he could see what his investigation accomplished, I think he'd be proud." I thought about the USB drive hidden in my father's watch, the evidence that had started this entire journey toward justice. He always said that doing the right thing was worth any risk. "He was right," Helen replied. "And so were you for refusing to let his death be meaningless." For the first time since receiving that phone call from Frank's pawn shop, I felt like my father's spirit could finally rest in peace. While Gary sat in federal custody awaiting his arraignment, Diana Walsh and Agent Mitchell approached Helen and me with an unexpected proposal that would help ensure the prosecution's case against Consolidated American Insurance was airtight. "We need to catch the insurance executives on tape authorizing additional murders," Diana explained during a meeting at the FBI field office in downtown Denver. "Gary's testimony is crucial, but juries are often skeptical of convicted criminals seeking reduced sentences." Agent Mitchell spread surveillance photos across the conference table, showing well-dressed men in expensive suits entering and leaving corporate offices. "These are the Consolidated American executives who ordered your father's death. Without recorded evidence of their direct involvement, they might escape prosecution by claiming they knew nothing about Gary's activities." "What kind of recorded evidence?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew where this conversation was heading. "We want to stage a scenario where you approach Consolidated American, claiming to have evidence that could expose their conspiracy," Diana said. "If they believe you're a threat, they'll contact Gary's replacement and authorize your elimination. We'll record everything." Helen immediately shook her head. "Absolutely not. Candy isn't risking her life to help prosecutors who can't build their own cases." "Mom, if these executives escape prosecution, they'll just recruit new killers and continue murdering construction workers," I replied. "Dad died trying to stop this conspiracy. We can't let his sacrifice be meaningless." Agent Mitchell leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had devoted years to this investigation. "We wouldn't ask you to do this without extensive safety measures. You'd be wearing recording devices followed by surveillance teams and protected by undercover agents at all times." "How would this work exactly?" Helen asked reluctantly. Diana opened a laptop and showed us detailed surveillance of Consolidated American's Denver office, a gleaming high-rise building in the financial district where insurance executives worked in luxury while ordering the deaths of construction workers hundreds of miles away. "You would pose as Christine Davis' sister, of a fictional Brookfield construction worker named Michael Davis who died in a suspicious accident," Diana explained. "We've created a complete background for Christine, including employment records, family photos, and a detailed knowledge of construction terminology." "Why would they believe I have evidence against them?" "Because Christine Davis has been asking questions," Agent Mitchell said. "We've had undercover agents contact various construction companies and insurance adjusters claiming to represent Michael Davis's family and hinting that he left behind documentation of safety violations and suspicious activities." Diana pulled up a series of phone records on her laptop. 3 different Consolidated American employees have already reported receiving inquiries about Michael Davis from someone claiming to be his sister. The executives are nervous. So they'll want to meet with me. They'll want to eliminate you, Agent Mitchell corrected grimly, just like they eliminated your father when he got too close to the truth. Helen grabbed my hand tightly. This is insane. You're talking about using my daughter as bait for murderers. These murderers are going to kill again whether we catch them or not, I said firmly. At least this way Dad's evidence can help stop them permanently. Over the next 3 hours, Diana and Agent Mitchell explained every detail of their plan. I would spend 2 days memorizing Christine Davis's background story, learning construction terminology, and practicing conversations with potential suspects. Federal agents would establish surveillance positions around Consolidated American's office building, while electronic specialists would wire me with recording devices sophisticated enough to capture conversations in noisy environments. The key to the operation's success was making the insurance executives believe that Christine Davis had evidence similar to what my father had gathered but hadn't yet contacted federal authorities. If they thought they could eliminate one more witness and permanently bury the conspiracy, they might authorize another murder while federal agents recorded the entire conversation. What if they don't take the bait? Helen asked. Then we proceed with prosecuting them based on Gary's testimony alone, Agent Mitchell replied. But that gives them a decent chance of beating the charges and continuing their operation under new management. And if they do take the bait, Diana smiled grimly. Then we record them ordering your murder and add conspiracy to commit murder charges that will guarantee life sentences. I thought about my father spending his final months documenting evidence of crimes that cost him his life, and I knew what his answer would be. Some fights were worth the risk because the alternative was letting evil triumph through cowardice. When do we start? I asked. Helen sighed deeply but nodded her agreement. If we're doing this, I want every possible safety precaution in place. Done, Agent Mitchell promised. Candy will be protected by a team of agents who have conducted dozens of similar operations. We won't let anything happen to her. Diana handed me a thick folder containing Christine Davis's fabricated life history. You have 48 hours to become Christine Davis. Study everything until you can recite her story without hesitation. As we prepared to leave the FBI office, Agent Mitchell gave us one final warning. Once we initiate contact with Consolidated American, there's no going back. They'll either ignore Christine Davis completely or move quickly to eliminate her. We need to be prepared for both possibilities. That evening, Helen and I sat at our kitchen table reviewing Christine Davis's fictional background while I tried to memorize details about a brother I'd never had and construction accidents I'd never witnessed. The weight of what we were attempting felt overwhelming, but every time I considered backing out, I thought about my father's courage in investigating these same criminals. Are you sure about this? Helen asked for the 10th time. I'm sure Dad would want us to finish what he started, I replied, studying photographs of the fictional Michael Davis that FBI technicians had created using computer software. Your father was also a trained construction worker who understood the dangers he was facing, Helen pointed out. You're a marketing coordinator with no experience dealing with killers. But I have something Dad didn't have, I said. I have the FBI backing me up with surveillance teams and recording equipment. Dad was investigating these people alone. Helen squeezed my hand. Promise me that if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you'll abort the operation and get to safety. I promise, I said, hoping I'd have the courage to keep that promise if the situation became dangerous. Diana called that night to confirm that Consolidated American executives had been asking questions about Christine Davis, apparently trying to verify whether Michael Davis had really existed and whether his family posed a threat to their conspiracy. The fact that they were investigating suggested they planned to take action once they confirmed Christine's identity. Tomorrow we wire you up and make contact, Diana said. Are you ready? I looked at my father's watch on my wrist, the timepiece that had started this entire journey toward justice, and found my answer. I'm ready. The Consolidated American Insurance Building stood 37 stories above downtown Denver, its glass and steel facade reflecting morning sunlight like a monument to corporate success. I stood across the street wearing a wire tap so sophisticated that FBI technicians could hear my heartbeat through their surveillance equipment, preparing to walk into the headquarters of the organization that had murdered my father. Diana Walsh's voice crackled through a nearly invisible earpiece hidden behind my hair. "Remember, you're Christine Davis, 28 years old, working as a bookkeeper in Colorado Springs. Your brother Michael died in a scaffolding accident at a Brookfield construction site 6 months ago." I crossed the street and entered the building's marble lobby where security guards directed me toward elevators that would carry me to the executive floor, where insurance companies decided which construction workers would live and which would die. My hands trembled as I pressed the button for the 32nd floor, but I forced myself to think about my father's courage during his final months of investigation. The elevator doors opened to reveal a reception area decorated with expensive artwork and fresh flowers, the kind of luxury that murder money could buy. A young woman with perfect makeup and a practiced smile greeted me from behind a mahogany desk. "Christine Davis to see Mr. Harrison," I said, using the name of the Consolidated American executive who had agreed to meet with me after Diana's carefully orchestrated phone calls. "Of course, Ms. Davis. Mr. Harrison is expecting you." James Harrison turned out to be a distinguished man in his 50s, with silver hair and the kind of confident demeanor that came from years of criminal success. His corner office overlooked the Rocky Mountains, with floor-to-ceiling windows that provided a view that my father would never see again. "Ms. Davis, please have a seat," Harrison said, gesturing toward leather chairs arranged around a coffee table. "I understand you have concerns about your brother's accident." I sat down, carefully conscious of the recording equipment hidden in my clothes and the surveillance team monitoring every word from a van parked outside the building. "Michael left behind some documents that I think you should see." Harrison's expression didn't change, but I noticed his hands tighten slightly on the arms of his chair. "What kind of documents?" "Safety reports, photographs of equipment violations, recordings of conversations with supervisors," I said, reciting the script Diana had prepared. Michael was very thorough about documenting problems at his job sites. "And what do you think these documents prove?" I pulled out a folder containing fabricated evidence that FBI specialists had created to support Christine Davis's story. That Brookfield Construction has been systematically ignoring safety violations to keep projects on schedule, and that insurance companies have been covering up the pattern to avoid paying claims. Harrison leaned forward to examine the fake documents, his eyes scanning pages that had been carefully designed to look authentic while containing no real evidence. "This is very concerning," he said after several minutes. "Have you shown these documents to anyone else?" "Not yet," I replied. "I wanted to give your company a chance to explain before I contact federal authorities." "Very wise," Harrison said, though his tone suggested anything but approval. "These kinds of allegations can be very damaging to everyone involved, even when they're based on misunderstandings." "Are you saying my brother's death was a misunderstanding?" Harrison stood up and walked to his window, apparently thinking carefully about his response. When he turned back, his expression had shifted from professional courtesy to something much colder. "Ms. Davis, I'm going to be very direct with you," he said. "Your brother was involved in activities that went far beyond normal construction work. He was documenting information that could be misinterpreted by people who don't understand the complexities of the insurance industry." "What kind of activities?" Michael was working with certain individuals to manufacture evidence of safety violations that could be used to file fraudulent insurance claims. Harrison said, completely reversing the truth of the situation. His death wasn't an accident. It was the result of criminal associates eliminating a witness who could expose their fraud scheme. I stared at Harrison in amazement, realizing he was trying to frame my fictional brother as a criminal while admitting that his death had been murder. "Are you saying someone killed Michael?" "I'm saying that people who get involved in insurance fraud often find themselves in dangerous situations," Harrison replied. and people who possess evidence of such fraud can become targets for elimination. The threat was clear, but carefully phrased to avoid explicit admission of guilt. Harrison was telling me that possessing evidence against Consolidated American was dangerous to my health, while simultaneously admitting that they eliminated people who threatened their operations. "What should I do with Michael's documents?" I asked. Harrison returned to his chair and leaned forward with predatory intensity. "You should give them to me immediately, Ms. Davis, along with any copies you might have made." "And then what?" "Then you forget about your brother's death and go back to your normal life in Colorado Springs," Harrison said. "Continuing to investigate this matter would be extremely hazardous to your well-being." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm trying to save your life," Harrison replied. "The same people who killed your brother are still operating, and they don't hesitate to eliminate anyone who possesses evidence that could expose their crimes." I pretended to consider his warning while Diana's voice whispered instructions through my earpiece. "Ask him about Gary Patterson specifically," she said. "What about Gary Patterson?" I asked. "Michael mentioned him in his notes as someone who was pressuring workers to ignore safety violations." Harrison's face went completely white. "Where did you hear that name?" "From Michael's recordings," I said, watching Harrison's composure crumble as he realized Christine Davis knew more than he'd expected. "Gary Patterson is dead," Harrison said quickly. "He died in a construction accident several months ago." "That's interesting," I replied, "because Gary Patterson was arrested yesterday by federal agents for murdering 17 construction workers." Harrison stood up abruptly and walked to his desk, where he picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. I couldn't hear the conversation, but his increasingly frantic gestures suggested it wasn't going well. "There's been a complication," Harrison said into the phone. "The Christine Davis situation is more serious than we thought. Yes, she knows about Patterson. No giving her money won't solve this problem. We need a permanent solution implemented immediately." He hung up and turned back to me with an expression that made my blood freeze. "Ms. Davis, I'm afraid our conversation is over." "Am I free to go?" "You're free to wait here while my associates arrange transportation for you," Harrison said. "Unfortunately, you've demonstrated that you possess information too dangerous to leave unaddressed." Diana's voice crackled urgently through my earpiece. "He just ordered your execution. Get out of there now." I stood up and moved toward the door, but Harrison stepped into my path. "I really can't let you leave," he said apologetically. "Not with what you know." "You can't keep me here against my will," I protested, though I could hear the fear in my own voice. "Actually, we can," Harrison replied. "Security will show you to a conference room where you'll be comfortable while we decide how to handle this situation." Two large men in security uniforms entered the office, their expressions making it clear that comfort wasn't their primary concern. I was trapped in a room 32 floors above street level, with men who had just admitted to ordering multiple murders. "This is Agent Mitchell," Diana's voice said through my earpiece. "SWAT teams are moving into the building now. Stall for 2 more minutes." "Before your associates do anything permanent," I said to Harrison, "there's something else you should know." "What's that?" I smiled as I heard elevator doors opening in the hallway outside Harrison's office. "Christine Davis is a fictional person created by the FBI, and everything you've said in the past 20 minutes has been recorded by federal agents." Harrison's face transformed from confident control to absolute terror as armed FBI agents burst through his office door with weapons drawn. Agent Mitchell led the team, speaking into a radio as she secured the room. "James Harrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder," she announced, producing handcuffs that seemed appropriate for someone who had spent years ordering the deaths of honest workers. As Harrison was led away in custody, I slumped into one of his leather chairs and tried to process what had just happened. In less than 30 minutes, we'd recorded a Consolidated American executive admitting to systematic murder, threatening to kill a witness, and ordering my immediate execution. Diana Walsh entered the office with a smile that suggested years of investigative work had finally paid off. "Outstanding performance," she said. Harrison gave us everything we need to prosecute the entire conspiracy. Is it over? I asked. This part is over, Diana replied. The rest depends on how many other executives decide to cooperate rather than face murder charges. Agent Mitchell approached with the recording equipment that had captured Harrison's confession. Your father would be proud, she said simply. This operation just guaranteed justice for every family those criminals destroyed. As federal agents secured Harrison's office and seized computers containing evidence of the insurance conspiracy, I thought about my father's final message hidden in his watch, for my princess, the truth about the Brookfield site. The truth had turned out to be bigger and more horrifying than either of us could have imagined, but it was finally being exposed to the world. Within hours of Harrison's arrest, the Consolidated American Insurance Building had been transformed into a federal crime scene with agents seizing computers, financial records, and communication devices from 37 floors of corporate offices. I watched from the lobby as executive after executive was led away in handcuffs, each one representing years of systematic murder disguised as business operations. Agent Mitchell coordinated the arrests from a command center established in the building's conference room, where multiple screens displayed the scope of the criminal network that my father's investigation had helped expose. The conspiracy involved 12 insurance companies, 47 construction firms, and 83 individual criminals operating across 7 states. We're executing simultaneous arrests in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and California. Agent Mitchell explained as I watched the coordinated operation unfold. Every person involved in ordering, facilitating, or conducting murders for insurance fraud is being taken into custody. Diana Walsh approached with a tablet displaying arrest warrants that seemed to scroll endlessly. 64 people arrested so far, including insurance executives, construction company owners, safety inspectors, and criminal operatives like Gary. The financial fraud we've uncovered exceeds $400 million. How many victims were there? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. 87 confirmed deaths, Diana replied solemnly. Your father was victim number 31, which means 56 people died after his investigation began. The weight of that revelation hit me like a physical blow. If my father's evidence had been discovered sooner, 56 people might still be alive. But I reminded myself that without his courage in documenting the conspiracy, none of the victims would have received justice. The victims' families are being notified, Agent Mitchell said gently. Many of them will finally learn that their loved ones didn't die in accidents, but were murdered by criminals who saw human life as an acceptable business expense. My phone rang with a call from Helen, who had been watching news coverage of the arrests from home. Are you safe? She asked immediately. I'm safe, Mom. The operation worked perfectly. They arrested everyone involved in the conspiracy. How many people? 64 so far, with more arrests happening across multiple states. The insurance fraud network is completely shut down. Helen was quiet for several moments before responding. Your father would be amazed to see what his investigation accomplished. He'd be proud of you too, I said. You risked everything to help expose Gary's crimes. I just wanted justice for Robert and all the other families those monsters destroyed. As evening approached, Agent Mitchell briefed me on what to expect during the coming months of legal proceedings. The trials will be extensive, she warned. Harrison and the other executives are facing federal murder charges that carry potential death sentences. They'll fight the charges aggressively. Will I have to testify? You'll be the star witness in Harrison's trial, Diana said. Your recording of his confession is the strongest evidence we have against the insurance executives. What about Gary? Gary's plea agreement requires him to testify against everyone involved in the conspiracy, Agent Mitchell explained. In exchange for his cooperation, he'll serve 25 years in federal prison instead of facing execution for 17 murders. The idea of Gary avoiding the death penalty still bothered me, but I understood that his testimony was crucial for convicting the executives who had ordered my father's death. Sometimes justice required accepting imperfect outcomes to achieve larger victories. "There's something else you need to know," Diana said, pulling me aside from the other federal agents. "Brett is coming out of witness protection tomorrow. He wants to see Helen and thank you for helping expose Gary's crimes." "How is Brett handling everything?" "Better than expected," Diana replied. "He feels guilty about not preventing his stepfather's crimes, but he understands that confronting Gary directly would have gotten everyone killed." "What happens to Brett now?" "He's entering the federal witness protection program permanently. Gary's associates in other states might try to retaliate against family members, so Brett will need a new identity and relocation to a secure location." I thought about Brett losing his entire life to protect our family from his stepfather's criminal associates, and I felt grateful for his courage in recording Gary's confessions. Without Brett's evidence, Gary might have escaped prosecution by claiming ignorance of the insurance conspiracy. "Can I see Brett before he disappears?" "Tomorrow afternoon," Diana promised. "He wants to say goodbye to Helen and explain why he couldn't tell her about the investigation." As the federal agents prepared to transport me home, Agent Mitchell handed me a business card for the Victim Services Coordinator, who would help our family navigate the complex legal proceedings ahead. "This will take years to fully resolve," she warned. "But your father's investigation is going to result in justice for dozens of families. And it will prevent hundreds of future murders," Diana added. "The construction industry will never again be able to ignore the kind of systematic killing that Consolidated American was facilitating." During the drive home, I reflected on everything that had happened since Frank from the pawn shop called to tell me about my father's watch. In less than 2 weeks, we'd exposed one of the largest criminal conspiracies in American history, arrested 64 criminals, and ensured that my father's death would save countless lives. But the personal cost had been enormous. Gary had destroyed our family's trust. Helen had learned that her marriage was built on lies and murder, and Brett was losing his identity to protect us from retaliation. The victory felt hollow when measured against the human damage that Gary's crimes had inflicted. As I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, I saw Helen waiting on the front porch, where my father used to sit reading construction manuals on Sunday afternoons. She looked older than her 53 years, worn down by grief and betrayal, but also stronger somehow, as if surviving Gary's deception had revealed reserves of resilience she hadn't known she possessed. "It's over," I called out as I walked toward the house. "No," Helen replied, embracing me tightly. "Now it begins. Now we figure out how to rebuild our lives after everything Gary destroyed." I looked at my father's watch, still keeping perfect time despite everything it had been through, and I knew she was right. Justice was just the beginning. Healing would take much longer. The next afternoon, Brett arrived at our house looking like a completely different person than the confident young man who had supposedly been building a tech startup. Federal agents had kept him in protective custody for 3 months while he gathered evidence against Gary, and the stress of living a double life had clearly taken its toll. "I'm so sorry," Brett said immediately upon seeing Helen, tears streaming down his face. "I should have told you what Gary was doing, but the FBI said that confronting him would get everyone killed." Helen embraced her stepson with the kind of maternal love that had nothing to do with blood relationships and everything to do with choosing to care for someone despite complicated circumstances. "You protected our family," she said firmly. "You risked your life to expose Gary's crimes." "But I let him live in this house for months while he planned to murder you," Brett protested. "Every day I watched him pretend to love you while knowing he was going to kill you for insurance money." "If you had confronted Gary, he would have killed you first and then killed Mom anyway," I pointed out. "Working with the FBI was the only way to save everyone." Brett nodded but still looked haunted by months of deception. "The hardest part was pretending to be a gambling addict while watching Gary steal from you and plan your murder. I wanted to warn you so many times, but Agent Mitchell said that any change in family dynamics might make Gary suspicious." Diana Walsh had accompanied Brett to our house, apparently to brief us on the final stages of the federal investigation and Brett's transition into permanent witness protection. Brett's recordings were crucial to building our case, she explained. Without his evidence, Gary might have escaped prosecution by claiming he was just a construction worker who made bad decisions. What did Brett actually record? Helen asked. Conversations between Gary and his handlers at Consolidated American discussions about targeting specific construction workers for elimination and planning sessions for staging accidents at job sites, Diana replied. Brett's recordings prove that Gary was operating under direct orders from insurance executives. Brett pulled out a small digital recorder that looked like a car key fob. I wore this device for 3 months, he said. Every conversation, every phone call, every planning session where Gary discussed his crimes was secretly recorded for federal agents. Weren't you terrified that Gary would discover the device? I asked. Every single day, Brett admitted. But I kept thinking about all the families Gary had destroyed, and I knew that stopping him was worth the risk. Helen squeezed Brett's hand. What happens to you now? Tomorrow, I become David Morrison from Phoenix, Arizona, Brett said sadly. New identity, new background, new life far away from anyone who might connect me to Gary Patterson or the insurance conspiracy. Will we ever see you again? Brett and Diana exchanged glances before Diana answered. Probably not. Brett's testimony is going to send dozens of criminals to prison for life. Retaliation against him or his family is a serious concern. But we can write to each other, Helen asked hopefully. Through secure channels managed by federal marshals, Diana confirmed. No direct contact, but you'll be able to stay informed about each other's well-being. The thought of losing Brett permanently felt like another death in our family, but I understood that his safety required complete separation from his previous life. Gary's criminal associates wouldn't hesitate to kill Brett if they could locate him, and they'd probably target Helen and me to send a message to other potential witnesses. There's something else, Diana said, producing a thick envelope from her briefcase. The federal government is providing compensation to families of the conspiracy's victims. Helen will receive $2 million in recognition of Robert's murder and the trauma Gary's infiltration caused your family. Helen stared at the envelope as if it contained something dangerous rather than financial security. I don't want blood money. It's not blood money, I said gently. It's acknowledgement that the government failed to protect Dad and the other victims. The money can't bring him back, but it can help ensure his sacrifice has lasting meaning. How? I thought about everything my father had believed in and everything he died trying to protect. We use the money to establish a foundation that provides safety training and equipment to construction workers. We turn Dad's death into something that saves lives instead of just ending them. Brett smiled for the first time since arriving at our house. Robert would love that idea. He always said that keeping workers safe was more important than keeping projects on schedule. The Robert Chen Memorial Construction Safety Foundation. Helen said slowly, testing how the name sounded. Providing safety training and equipment to workers across Colorado. Across the entire Mountain West, I corrected. If we're going to honor Dad's memory, we should think as big as he would have thought. Diana nodded approvingly. The foundation would also serve as a lasting reminder of what happens when corporate greed values profits over human life. It could help prevent future conspiracies like the one that killed your father. Over the next 2 hours, we discussed the practical details of establishing a non-profit foundation and the legal procedures for accessing the federal compensation money. Brett would help design the foundation's safety training programs during his final weeks before entering witness protection, ensuring that his stepfather's crimes contributed to preventing similar tragedies. I want workers to know that speaking up about safety violations won't get them killed, Brett said. The foundation should provide anonymous reporting systems and legal protection for whistleblowers, and emergency financial assistance for families of workers who die in legitimate accidents, Helen added. Not everyone who loses a loved one in construction has the resources to fight for justice. As evening approached, we realized this would be our last dinner together as a family. Tomorrow, Brett would become David Morrison and disappear into federal witness protection, leaving behind everyone he'd ever known to ensure that Gary's co-conspirators couldn't retaliate against our family. "I want you to know," Brett said as we cleared the dinner dishes, "that these past 3 months of protecting you have been the most meaningful thing I've ever done. Even though I couldn't tell you what was happening, I felt like I was finally living up to the kind of man Robert would have wanted me to become." Helen hugged Brett tightly, tears flowing freely. "Your father would be proud of the courage you've shown, and Robert would be grateful that you protected our family when we couldn't protect ourselves. Take care of each other," Brett said, embracing both Helen and me. "And remember that Dad's death wasn't meaningless. Everything we've accomplished over the past few months proves that good people can triumph over evil when they're willing to fight for justice." As Brett left our house for the final time, I watched from the front porch until his car disappeared around the corner, taking with it the last connection to the family that Gary's crimes had destroyed. But in the morning, Helen and I would begin building something new from the ashes of that destruction. Something that would honor my father's memory while protecting other families from the kind of evil that had consumed our lives. The Robert Chen Memorial Construction Safety Foundation would ensure that my father's final investigation saved lives for generations to come. 6 months later, I stood in a packed federal courthouse in downtown Denver as Judge Patricia Williams sentenced James Harrison to life in prison without possibility of parole for his role in ordering the deaths of 87 construction workers. Harrison's conviction marked the culmination of the largest insurance fraud prosecution in American history, with 64 defendants receiving sentences ranging from 25 years to death. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Williams said as she delivered the sentence, "you and your co-conspirators turned murder into a business model treating human life as an acceptable expense for corporate profits. The evidence shows that you personally authorized the deaths of at least 37 workers, including Robert Chen, whose courageous investigation ultimately exposed your criminal enterprise." I felt Helen squeeze my hand as the judge specifically mentioned my father, acknowledging his sacrifice in bringing down the conspiracy that had claimed so many lives. Gary sat at the defendant's table looking older and more broken than I'd ever seen him awaiting his own sentencing after cooperating with federal prosecutors throughout the trials. "Gary Patterson." Judge Williams continued, "Your cooperation with this investigation has helped secure convictions against the masterminds of this conspiracy. In recognition of your assistance and pursuant to your plea agreement, this court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole." Gary turned to look at Helen and me before federal marshals led him away in shackles. I saw no remorse in his eyes, only the hollow emptiness of a man who had sold his humanity for money and discovered that neither wealth nor freedom could fill the void he'd created. The sentences handed down today represent justice for 87 murdered workers and their families, Judge Williams announced to the packed courtroom. But more importantly, they demonstrate that no criminal conspiracy, regardless of its size or sophistication, can ultimately escape the consequences of its actions when courageous individuals are willing to risk everything to expose the truth. After the sentencing, Diana Walsh and Agent Mitchell briefed us on the final resolution of the conspiracy cases. Consolidated American Insurance had been permanently shut down with its assets seized to compensate victims' families. 47 construction companies had been prosecuted for their involvement in the fraud scheme, with many losing their operating licenses permanently. The construction industry has implemented new safety protocols based on your father's investigation, Agent Mitchell explained. Anonymous reporting systems, independent safety inspections, and federal oversight that should prevent similar conspiracies from developing. "What about the other families?" Helen asked. "The other victims of this conspiracy?" Diana smiled. 86 families received federal compensation similar to what you received. Many of them are establishing foundations, scholarships, and safety programs in their loved ones' memory. Your father's investigation didn't just bring down criminals, it created a movement for worker safety that's spreading across the entire construction industry. And Brett, I asked, though I knew the answer would be limited by security concerns. David Morrison is doing well in his new life, Agent Mitchell replied carefully. He's working as a safety consultant for construction companies using his knowledge of Gary's crimes to help identify and prevent similar fraud schemes. His work is saving lives every day. That evening, Helen and I attended the grand opening of the Robert Chen Memorial Construction Safety Training Center, the first facility established by our foundation in a converted warehouse near downtown Denver. Construction workers from across Colorado had gathered to learn about safety protocols, workers' rights, and anonymous reporting systems that would protect them from retaliation by employers who prioritize profits over human life. Frank from the pawn shop served as the guest of honor, cutting the ribbon to officially open the training center that existed, because he'd trusted his instincts about a watch that felt heavier than it should have. Robert would be proud to see his investigation saving lives instead of just ending them, Frank said to the assembled crowd. Sometimes the smallest actions, like noticing an unusual watch or trusting your gut about suspicious behavior, can change the world. The training center's first class included 23 construction workers who learned about recognizing safety violations, reporting dangerous conditions, and protecting themselves from employers who might retaliate against whistleblowers. Each graduate received a certificate signed by Helen and me, along with contact information for legal resources and emergency assistance. Your father believed that every worker deserved to go home safely to their family, Helen told the graduating class. This training center exists to honor that belief and to ensure that no family experiences the kind of loss we experienced. As the evening concluded, I walked through the training center's halls, reading displays that documented the insurance conspiracy and the courage of workers like my father, who had risked everything to expose corporate crimes. Photos of all 87 victims lined one wall, each face representing a family that had been destroyed by the greed of insurance executives and construction company owners. My father's photograph occupied a place of honor at the center of the memorial wall with a plaque that read, "Robert Chen, construction worker, safety advocate, and hero. His investigation exposed one of the largest criminal conspiracies in American history and saved countless lives through his courage to document the truth." Below his photograph was a smaller plaque containing the message he'd hidden in his watch, "For my princess," the truth about the Brookfield site. But now everyone could see that the truth extended far beyond a single construction site to encompass a nationwide network of murder for profit that had claimed 87 lives before finally being exposed. "Do you think he would be proud?" Helen asked as we prepared to leave the training center. I looked at my father's watch, still keeping perfect time after everything it had been through, and I knew the answer. He'd be amazed that his investigation accomplished so much more than he ever imagined possible. And he'd be proud of the courage you showed in finishing what he started. "We finished what he started," I corrected. "All of us together. You, me, Brett, Diana, Agent Mitchell, even Frank from the pawn shop. Dad's investigation was just the beginning." As we drove home through the Denver streets where my father had worked and died, I reflected on everything that had changed since that phone call from Eddie's pawn shop. Gary was in federal prison, the insurance conspiracy had been dismantled, and 87 families had received justice for their murdered loved ones. But most importantly, the Robert Chen Memorial Construction Safety Foundation would continue my father's work of protecting construction workers for generations to come. His death had meaning because it led to something larger than revenge or justice. It led to prevention of future tragedies and protection of workers who might never know that their safety was secured by a man who died 3 years ago trying to expose the truth about dangerous working conditions. My father's legacy wasn't just the criminals he'd helped convict or the compensation his investigation had secured for victim families. His legacy was a safer construction industry where workers' lives mattered more than corporate profits, where safety violations couldn't be ignored, and where speaking up about dangerous conditions wouldn't result in retaliation or death. That night, I placed my father's watch in a display case at the training center, where it would remind future generations of construction workers that one person's courage to document the truth could change an entire industry and save countless lives. The truth about the Brookfield site had become the truth about protecting workers everywhere. 2 years after Gary's sentencing, I stood before a crowd of 500 construction workers, safety inspectors, and family members of workplace accident victims at the annual Robert Chen Memorial Safety Conference in Denver. The conference had grown from a small gathering honoring my father's memory into a national event that brought together everyone committed to preventing workplace deaths through safety advocacy and criminal justice reform. Today marks the 3rd anniversary of my father's death and the 2nd anniversary of exposing the insurance conspiracy that killed him. I began looking out at faces representing every aspect of the construction industry, but more importantly, today marks 2 years without a single suspicious workplace death in Colorado, Wyoming, or New Mexico. The crowd erupted in applause, recognizing that the absence of mysterious accidents represented lives saved and families protected from the kind of devastation that had consumed our family 3 years earlier. The Robert Chen Memorial Construction Safety Foundation had trained over 3,000 workers, investigated hundreds of safety complaints, and prevented countless accidents through proactive intervention and advocacy. Helen joined me at the podium carrying a folder containing updates on the Foundation's expanding programs and the ongoing legal proceedings against remaining conspiracy members. 2 years ago, I thought my husband died in a random accident, she said. Today, I know that Robert died as a hero, whose investigation saved hundreds of lives and transformed an entire industry. The Foundation has established training centers in 12 states. I continued, with plans to expand nationwide over the next 5 years. We've partnered with federal agencies to create anonymous reporting systems, legal protection for whistleblowers, and emergency assistance for families affected by workplace violence. But the conference wasn't just about celebrating successes. We also remembered the victims whose deaths had exposed the conspiracy and the families who were still healing from their losses. 86 other families had lost loved ones to the same criminal network that killed my father, and many of them had traveled to Denver to share their stories and support continued advocacy efforts. Sarah Martinez lost her husband Juan to a staged crane accident in New Mexico. I said introducing a woman whose courage in pursuing justice had helped convict 3 additional conspiracy members. Sarah's investigation led to prosecutions that might never have happened without her determination to understand why safety equipment failed at exactly the wrong moment. Sarah approached the microphone with the kind of strength that came from surviving the worst possible loss and choosing to fight for other families' protection. Juan documented safety violations just like Robert Chen did, she said. The criminals who killed our husbands thought that murdering witnesses would silence the evidence. Instead, they created a movement that will protect workers for generations. The conference continued with presentations from federal agents who had dismantled the insurance conspiracy construction company owners, who had implemented new safety protocols, and workers who had used Foundation resources to report dangerous conditions without fear of retaliation. Each speaker represented a different aspect of the systematic changes that had resulted from my father's investigation. Diana Walsh, now working as the Foundation's chief investigator, provided updates on ongoing prosecutions and emerging threats to worker safety. The Consolidated American Conspiracy is permanently dismantled, she reported, but we continue monitoring for similar schemes that might target vulnerable workers in other industries. Construction isn't the only industry where workers face retaliation for reporting safety violations, she continued. The foundation is expanding into oil drilling, mining, and chemical processing, where similar conspiracies could develop if we don't maintain vigilant oversight. Agent Mitchell, who had been promoted to head the FBI's white-collar crime division, spoke about the lasting impact of the insurance conspiracy prosecutions. The Robert Chen investigation fundamentally changed how we approach workplace deaths, she explained. What used to be dismissed as accidents are now investigated as potential crimes, with federal resources devoted to protecting workers who speak up about dangerous conditions. Your father's courage to document evidence despite personal risk created a model for worker advocacy that's being implemented nationwide, she told me. Federal agents are now embedded in high-risk industries, monitoring for patterns that might indicate criminal conspiracies targeting workers. The conference's final presentation came from someone I hadn't seen since he'd entered federal witness protection 2 years earlier. Brett, now living as David Morrison, appeared via secure video link to address the gathering and provide updates on his work as a safety consultant. Gary Patterson was my stepfather, and his crimes destroyed my family. Brett said, his image transmitted from an undisclosed location. But Robert Chen's investigation gave our family the opportunity to choose justice over loyalty to a killer. Today I work with construction companies across the Mountain West to identify and prevent safety violations that could be exploited by criminal conspiracies, he continued. Every day I see evidence that Robert's investigation is continuing to save lives through the systems and protocols that grew out of his courage. Brett's presentation included statistics showing dramatic improvements in construction safety across all states where foundation training programs had been implemented. Workplace fatalities had decreased by 37% in areas with active foundation presence, while reporting of safety violations had increased by over 200%. Workers are no longer afraid to speak up about dangerous conditions, Brett explained, because they know the foundation will protect them from retaliation and ensure their concerns are addressed by federal authorities. As the conference concluded, Helen and I announced the foundation's largest expansion, yet the Robert Chen Institute for Workplace Justice, a research facility that would study criminal conspiracies targeting workers and develop prevention strategies for industries beyond construction. The Institute will ensure that no industry can hide systematic murder behind claims of workplace accidents, Helen announced. Robert's investigation proved that individual courage can expose even the largest criminal conspiracies. But individual courage shouldn't be necessary to protect workers from being murdered for profits, I added. The Institute will create systems that protect whistleblowers and prevent conspiracies before they claim lives. That evening, Helen and I visited my father's grave for the first time since Gary's sentencing. The simple granite headstone now included an inscription that read, "Beloved husband and father. His investigation saved countless lives." "Do you think we've done enough to honor his memory?" Helen asked as we stood beside the grave. I thought about the training centers, the safety protocols, the prosecuted criminals, and the lives saved through programs built on my father's investigation. "We've made a good start," I replied, "but Dad's work isn't finished until no worker has to risk their life to report safety violations. How will we know when that day comes?" When construction workers go home safely to their families every night without having to wonder whether speaking up about dangerous conditions might cost them their jobs or their lives. Helen smiled. "Then we have a lot more work to do." As we prepared to leave the cemetery, I noticed a small American flag planted beside my father's headstone, apparently left by someone who understood that his investigation had served the country by exposing crimes that threatened the safety of working Americans everywhere. "Someone else remembers what Dad accomplished," I said, pointing to the flag. "Hundreds of people remember," Helen replied. "Every worker who received foundation safety training, every family that didn't lose a loved one to a preventable accident, every construction site where supervisors prioritized safety over profits." Driving home through the Denver neighborhoods where my father had worked and lived, I reflected on everything that had changed since receiving that phone call from Frank's pawn shop 3 years earlier. The personal cost had been enormous. We'd lost our trust, and family endured months of fear and uncertainty, and learned that people we loved were capable of unspeakable evil. But the larger victory was undeniable. An entire criminal network had been dismantled, dozens of criminals had been imprisoned for life, and systematic changes had been implemented to protect workers across multiple industries. My father's death had become the catalyst for one of the largest worker protection movements in American history. The watch that had started this journey now rested in a place of honor at the Foundation's first training center, where thousands of workers had seen it and learned about the courage required to document evidence that powerful criminals wanted to remain hidden. But my father's real legacy wasn't a timepiece or a foundation or even the criminals he'd helped convict. His legacy was the knowledge that ordinary people could triumph over extraordinary evil when they were willing to risk everything for justice. Construction workers no longer had to face dangerous conditions alone because they knew the Foundation would support their efforts to improve safety. Families no longer had to accept that workplace deaths were inevitable accidents because federal authorities now investigated suspicious patterns with the seriousness they deserved. Most importantly, no other family would have to endure what we had endured because my father's investigation had exposed the truth about how corporate greed could turn murder into a business model. The insurance conspiracy was permanently dismantled, its leaders were imprisoned for life, and its victims had received justice that honored their memory while protecting future generations of workers. As I parked in front of our house on Maple Street, where my father used to sit reading construction manuals on Sunday afternoons, I realized that his death had ultimately accomplished exactly what he would have wanted. It had made the world safer for working people and their families. The truth about the Brookfield site had become the truth about protecting workers everywhere, and that truth would continue saving lives long after everyone involved in the conspiracy had been forgotten. But before we end this story, I want to ask you something that my father would have asked. Have you ever witnessed unsafe working conditions that were ignored by supervisors who prioritized profits over people? Have you seen situations where workers were afraid to speak up about dangerous practices because they feared retaliation? These problems exist in every industry, not just construction, and they can only be solved when ordinary people have the courage to document evidence and demand accountability. My father's story proves that individual courage can expose even the largest criminal conspiracies and create lasting change that protects countless lives. But individual courage should never be the only protection workers have against being murdered for corporate profits. If this story moved you, please like this video to help others learn about the importance of workplace safety advocacy. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about ordinary people fighting extraordinary corruption. Share this video with anyone who works in construction, manufacturing, or other industries where safety violations could cost lives. And most importantly, comment below with your own experiences or thoughts about how we can continue protecting workers from the kind of criminal conspiracies that killed my father. Thank you for listening to my family's story and for caring enough about worker safety to support the ongoing fight for justice. Together, we can ensure that no other family loses a loved one to preventable workplace violence disguised as accidents. Remember, your voice matters, your safety matters, and your courage to speak up about dangerous conditions could save lives just like my father's investigation saved lives. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never let anyone convince you that profits are more important than human life. This is Candy Chen, and this was the story of how my father's hidden message in a watch exposed one of the largest criminal conspiracies in American history and created a movement that continues protecting workers today.